So let's talk now about storing data. So traditionally, what happens is people use relational databases. And let's just talk a little bit about what a relational database looks like. So the idea of a relational database is we have tables with fixed columns. For each row is a piece of data. So for instance, if we were storing, let's say, lists, we might have a table. So let's say we're supporting multiple users. So we might have a users table. And in the users table, we might have, for instance, a name and an ID and maybe an email, who knows what else. And then we'd have various entries in here. And then we could have a separate table, which is, let's say, the lists. So let's say each user can have a list. So we'd have another table, and in here we would have name, which would be the name of the list, and the ID, which would be ID of the list. And then separately, we might have, let's say, an items table, which contains each of the items. So it would be an item. Let's see, this is the text of the item. And as always, we're going to have an ID. And maybe we'd have completed. Okay. So that's what things would look like. And if we looked at a particular user, right, maybe we have Prof. Rhodes, and the ID is 62, and this is Rhodes at whatever. And then we might have a list, which is, let's say, groceries. And the ID of this might be 65. And then here are the items. We might have bananas. And this ID is, 152. And the idea with these IDs is that they're distinct within a particular table. Okay, but across tables, they can be duplicates. And then completed, let's say, is false. And then we also have, as well as bananas, let's say milk, which is 137, and that is true. And then part of what we do with relational databases is we do what is called normalization. And there's a lot of aspects of normalization, but the basic idea is we don't duplicate information. Okay, so we're not going to duplicate, for instance, in the items, the name of the list that it is contained in. Right, that would be a form of duplication under the theory that if we ever needed to change the list name, we want to have one place to change it rather than multiple places. And so what can we do with this? Let's look at an idea. So let's say we want to find. So what are we going to do? We're going to have a goal, which is to find. Let's do the first 5 lists for user ID, my user ID. All right, so let's say you want to find the first 5 lists for user ID, my user ID. But what there is a special language for doing this called SQL, structured query language. And so you would do something like, let's say, so you'd select the name and the ID from the lists table, and then you get to specify which subset of items in that list. Okay, because there may be a bunch of different lists and you don't want them all. So for instance, they're going to be lists for all of the other users, right? Right. So if I just go look at here, there's also, Joe's in here, and Joe's number 75, and he has an email address, whatever. And so what we'll actually add in here then is a given list, let's say, is going to belong to a particular user ID. Okay, so this particular user ID for this groceries list might be 62, and then there'd be others in there for, let's say, Joe. In fact, let's just give Joe a groceries list, right? So he has a groceries list for his user ID, and he could have multiple lists, and I could have multiple lists as well. All right, so we're going to say we want a subset of the lists. Basically, what we want is the user ID from the table to equal my user ID, whatever that was. You know, in this case, it'll be, let's say, 62. So somehow we already knew a user ID. Okay, and what do we want to do? Maybe we want to, let's actually add a couple of other things in here. Right, let's go ahead and add in a creation date. Okay, so that we can then order by, that is sort by the creation date, so that we see the earliest ones first. And then let's say we're in our application and we're displaying the first screen, which shows a bunch of lists, right? Maybe we only have enough space to show 5 lists. So rather than get all, I don't know, maybe we have 100 or 200 lists in this table, let's just limit this to the 5 we can display. Okay. So this would go ahead and run and do its SQL magic, its database magic. So it does some work of, for instance, there are probably indexes in this table, so it doesn't have to iterate through every item in the table, every row in the table. Instead, the index can allow it to, in constant time, let's say, go to the particular subset of rows that have a matching user ID. We can look at a more complicated example. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so let's look at a different example. So here what we're going to do is find the first 15 items from the list with ID, list ID. So we are actually missing something here. What we actually need in this table is we also want to know for each item, which list does it belong to? So we'll actually add in a list ID here. Okay, so this might be, for instance, my groceries list ID and my groceries list ID. But there'd be a lot of other rows here, right? It'd be the union of all items for all lists for all users. So we hope when we try to find the first 15 items to display from this particular list ID that it's not going to have to do order the length of the items list. So let's look at how we'll do that again. This is using SQL. So we're going to have to do now something like this. So we will select, let's say, the text. And what else will we need to know? So we're going to need maybe the completed, because we're going to want to show whether it's completed or not. Maybe that's all we're going to need. Maybe we'll need the ID too if we want to actually do anything to it. So we'll select this from items. And then again, where list ID equals, let's call this one my list ID. All right, and we can go ahead and order this also. By creation date, assuming that is that we have a creation date column here. So we better have set that up. And then we will, let's say, limit to 15, right? Because we only want to find the first 15. Okay, so that'll work for that. Now let's look at something that's a little more complicated. Okay? Let's say that we want to find all the items for all of a particular user's lists. This is going to be a little more complicated because we're going to actually need to use more than one table to do this query. Right, so what will we do? We'll go ahead. So our goal is, again, to find all items for all lists for user, my user ID. Right, so we'll do something like this. We will select. So from the items, we want the text. From the items, we want completed. From the lists, we'll want, let's say, the name and the ID. And then from, right, what are we selecting from? Well, we're going to select from both the items array, items table, and we're going to join that together with the items table, with the lists table. And how we're going to join it? We're going to join it where the list ID matches the list ID from the items. And what else do we want? Well, it's also important that we get the appropriate user ID. So we want lists user ID equals to my user ID. Okay, so we just specify in this, it's kind of a declarative approach language where we declare what we want, and then it's up to the database to actually figure out the quickest way to carry this out. So there's a lot of optimization that gets done. And when you have complicated SQL queries, right, they might be multiple tables that we are joining together and doing all sorts of stuff on, right? So you might have quite the lengthy list. But this is the basic idea. You store stuff in tables. Normally, every row in a table has an ID that's associated with it, so it can be referred to from some other table. And you store information in this fashion. Okay. Now we'd have to organize it differently if, for example, we could share lists, right? If we wanted to share lists between users, then all of a sudden, having this user ID in the list is no good, right? Because lists don't belong to a particular user, they can belong to multiple users. So in that case, we would go ahead and have a separate table which represents the mappings between users and lists. So that we would have an entry in there that would contain a user ID and a list ID, and that would mean that this user has access to this list. Maybe we'd keep a user ID as sort of the owner user ID, and then we keep all the sharing information in a separate table. Who knows?